Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Cairns, and this is going to be a relatively short lecture about the types of connective tissues, a little bit of information about what they do, but mostly how to identify them under the microscope. So, in terms of connective tissues, these are different from epithelial tissues because they're doing different things. So epithelial tissues, remember, those were serving as your coverings and linings. Connective tissues are doing other things, actually quite a few other things. They can support tissues, and often we find connective tissues that are the supporting tissues for epithelial tissues. They can serve as protection, for insulation, storing energy, and transporting substances. So there's a wide variety of tissue types that fall under this connective tissue category, and they look very different under the microscope. There are four main classes of tissues, and some of these have subcategories. The first is connective tissue proper, and then we have cartilage, and there's bone tissue and blood. We look at, we're going to look at these in a little more detail in a minute. Let me just call your attention to the kinds of things you're going to be able to find in your textbook. So these are tables. This is in chapter 4 of the textbook. These are tables that give a pretty good summary of the different types of connective tissues, particularly telling you, the features and functions of those tissues and what types of components that you find in each of those types of connective tissues. So now this leads to some of the main characteristics that are common to all types of connective tissues. In terms of blood supply. So if you recall, we talked a little bit about this with epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues don't have their own blood supply. They are avascular. That is not necessarily true of all types of connective tissues. So these connective tissues can vary in terms of their vascularity. Some connective tissues don't have a blood supply, like cartilage, whereas others have a large blood supply, like bone. So it really depends on the tissue that you're talking about. A big thing that's common to all connective tissues is the fact that the cells and the other components of those connective tissues are suspended within an extracellular matrix. So this means that when you're looking at a tissue under the microscope, and if you see more than just cells, maybe you see cells, maybe you see fiber-looking things, and if you see a background of that tissue, chances are you are looking at a connective tissue. So epithelial tissues are only cells, but connective tissues have cells and this extracellular matrix, and you will find in that extracellular matrix not only cells, but fibers as well. And depending on the type of connective tissue you're talking about, that will dictate what types of cells and what types of fibers you're going to find. There's also something in this in connective tissue called ground substance, and that's part of the extracellular matrix. So we've got ground substance and fibers that are part of the extracellular matrix, and then within that extracellular matrix you will find cells. What is that ground substance? Basically, a gel-like material that fills the space between the cells. You'll find interstitial fluid in there, you'll find some proteins in there, and some water as well. The fibers that you will find in most of these connective tissues, not all connective tissues. There's three main types of fibers, and when we look at some of these under the microscope, I'll try to point out to you how to distinguish them among each other. Collagen fibers are the most abundant types of fiber. They're very tough, lots of tensile strength, meaning you can pull them at either end and they're going to be really strong. Those tend to look under the microscope, they tend to look thicker and less defined. The edges are less defined. Elastic fibers, long, thin, very often they're squiggly under the microscope, but they don't have to be. But these are responsible for stretch. And then reticular fibers, short, fine, highly branched. They're going to definitely look more like tree branches when you look at them under the microscope compared to these other fibers. The types of cells that you find in a connective tissue depends on the connective tissue. Many times, though, you will find two classes of cells within a connective tissue. You will find blast cells, meaning immature cells that are actively creating this ground substance, and the extracellular matrix fibers. They're there to kind of create and maintain that connective tissue. And you will find site cells. These are more mature cells. They're there for maintenance of the matrix, but they're not actually forming new extracellular matrix. So, for example, in most connective tissues, you're going to find fibroblasts. They are actively secreting extracellular matrix, but there also might be fibrocytes. Those are the mature form of the fibroblast. They're not actively secreting extracellular matrix, but they're there to maintain the connective tissue in general. There are other types of cells that, depending on which type of connective tissue you are, you may find them in that tissue and you may not. Chondroblast, osteoblasts, chondrocytes, osteocytes. So there are a lot of different types of cells. Let's start talking about the four main types of tissues. So that first class is called connective tissue proper. And you can see here there are two subclasses, and within each of those subclasses, there are three types. So there's really a total of 6 types of connective tissue proper. We have loose connective tissues and dense connective tissues. So let's look at loose connective tissues. The first of these is areolar connective tissue. You're going to find this all over the place. It's really there for support, binding together of other tissues, packing material. There are, as you can see, this is what I'm talking about when you're looking at a connective tissue. You see these dots right here. Those are nuclei of cells, but you see other things too. It's not like an epithelial tissue where all you see are cells packed together. There's space in between the cells here, and you see these long, fibery looking things in this particular connective tissue. This is a clue that you are looking at a connective tissue. Now the question is, which one are you looking at? You can see there is more than one type of fiber. So these dark skinny ones, those are elastic fibers. They will always stain dark and they will always look skinny under the microscope. The ones that are more pinkish here, now they're not always going to be pink. It depends on how the slide was prepared, but in this case they're pink. But do you see how they're a little more diffuse looking, kind of thicker but not as defined? Those are collagen fibers. The cells that we're looking at, the nuclei, those are fibroblast nuclei. So this is a pretty good representation of areolar connective tissue. It's one of the loose connective tissues. Loose because the things that are in this tissue are loosely organized, and they're not very organized per se, in that it's almost like in disarray. And I put a note here. Areolar connective tissue is often confused with nervous tissue. So when you're looking at this tissue, pull up a picture of nervous tissue and look at them side by side and see why I said that they are often confused with one another, and then try to point out the differences between them so you don't get confused. Another one of these loose connective tissues is adipose tissue. This is a tissue that you should be able to identify immediately. You shouldn't even have to think about whether or not this is an epithelial tissue, a connective tissue, a muscle tissue, or nervous tissue. This is one of those where it's a very distinct looking tissue, and you should just know it right off the bat. This is one of those connective tissues that in this picture that you're looking at right now, you can see that there's space in between these cells. It doesn't always look like that. Often these cells are jam-packed together and you could argue, oh, those are just cells. It's connective tissue. But the reason it's not is because the way these cells are made, they look like soap bubbles. And in fact, what is really in these cells? The nuclei of these cells are pushed up against the cell membrane. So the nuclei are not in the middle of these cells. They are pushed up against the membrane because the rest of the cell is filled with fat. These cells are called adipocytes. They are filled with fat. This is our fat storage. And that's why these cells look like soap bubbles. So if you look at something, you say that looks like bubbles, you automatically know that is adipose connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue, the last of the loose connective tissues. We have these thick, dark staining, branching looking fibers. That's what reticular fibers look like. And lots of nuclei in here. The nuclei are fibroblasts, and you might find some other types of cells in this tissue as well. But this gives the sense of when you're looking at it, it looks like, okay, I see some branches and what looks like berries kind of stuck to these branches. That is a clue that you're looking at reticular connective tissue. All right, so those are the loose connective tissue proper. We have 3 other types of connective tissue proper, and these are the dense connective tissues. The first of these is dense regular connective tissue. Very high tensile strength, meaning you can grab a piece of this tissue at both ends and start pulling in both directions, and it's going to hold its shape. Because dense regular connective tissue consists of layers and layers and layers of collagen fibers. That's what you're mainly looking at here. That's what's staining pink in this picture. Lots of collagen fibers packed on top of one another in parallel. It almost looks like waves here, and I kind of pointed that out in my note. The nuclei of the fibroblasts that you find in this tissue, they're kind of hard to see. They are staining dark purple, and they look like they've been flattened and stretched. And in a sense, they have been, because the collagen fibers are so densely packed. This is why this is a dense connective tissue. They're so densely packed that they squish those nuclei. My note here says sometimes dense connective tissue is confused with smooth muscle tissue. So on your own, pull both of those pictures up and look at them side by side and see why I said that, and then try to find the differences so you can distinguish among them. You're going to find this tissue in your tendons, which are the tissues that attach your muscles to your bones, and your ligaments, which are attaching bones to bones across a joint. So you want this strong tensile ability because your muscles are constantly being pulled and your ligaments are constantly being pulled when you're moved. Another type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular connective tissue. So note that we're looking at collagen fibers here. Do you see how in this case they don't stain pink, they stain blue? Again, it just depends on how the tissue is prepared for the microscope. So you really can't use color to tell you anything about these tissues. But how do I know these are collagen fibers? Well, I know they're not cells because you would see a defined nucleus if it was a cell. So that tells me right away, okay, I'm looking at a connective tissue because I'm seeing something else. So chances are it's a fiber. Collagen fibers are thicker than the other two, and they don't have super sharp defined edges. And in this case, these collagen fibers are not really organized and stacked upon one another in a parallel fashion like we saw with dense regular connective tissue. Instead, these collagen fibers are going all over the place. You do see a few nuclei here. Those are fibroblast nuclei. That's what's creating the collagen fibers. and other parts of the matrix. In other examples of this tissue, and I encourage you to try and find different images of the same tissue to get a feel for what they really truly look like. Sometimes this looks like marbled meat. Elastic connective tissue, the last of the dense connective tissues. We see, it's really hard, even in this image, it's hard to see any nuclei here. All you're really looking at are these layers of elastic fibers. In this case, the elastic fibers are staining really dark and lots of layers, and they're all kind of running in parallel. So this is elastic connective tissue. So any tissue that's really stretchy, you're going to find this tissue. Your aorta, large artery walls need to be stretchy and strong. There is another connective tissue that has the word elastic in it, and it's very important that you are very clear when you're naming these tissues. So this is elastic connective tissue. And I'll point out the other one in a second. So those were the connective tissue proper connective tissues. There was dense connective tissues and there was loose connective tissues. Now we're going to look at the second main category of connective tissues, which are cartilages. There are three types of cartilages: hyaline, elastic cartilage, here's that other elastic tissue, and fibrocartilage. The common component in these three cartilages are the types of cells that you find within them. They're called chondrocytes. Anytime you hear the word chondro, think cartilage. Chondrocytes, and there will be chondroblasts as well. The chondroblasts are secreting the extracellular matrix. When those cells become mature and now serve more of a maintenance purpose, they're called chondrocytes. But another thing that is indicative of cartilage is that these chondrocytes are found within these cavities called lacunae. They're like little, almost look like membrane-bound spaces called lacunae. So let's show you an example. So this is hyaline cartilage. One, you see these really dark dots? Those are nuclei, so you know there are cells here. You see there's background. Okay, so you know it's not epithelial tissue. It must be a connective tissue. And you see what appears to be that you have a nucleus, and so you see this border around the nucleus. You might jump to conclusions and say, well, that's just the cell membrane for that cell, but it's not. The cell membranes don't often stain very clearly when you're looking at tissues. So when you see a cell nucleus, know that that membrane is there, but often not very visible. Instead, what these borders are around the nuclei, those are those spaces or cavities called the lacunae. And note, they're really bright. They have this glassy, iridescent appearance under the microscope, almost like they're shiny. And that tells you, okay, that's a lacuna. And if I see a lacuna, it's probably a cartilage that I'm looking at, and the cell inside that lacuna is a chondrocyte. This is hyaline cartilage. I would consider the lacunae in hyaline cartilage to be medium-sized. So the other two cartilages, the lacunae, will be either bigger or smaller than this. There are fibers within this cartilage. They're not as defined. So you don't see real stringy looking fibers. So that tells you not only the fact that there are lacunae here, that it's a cartilage, but that more specifically it's hyaline cartilage. You find this at the end of your nose, at the ends of your long bones, your trachea, your larynx, cartilages of your ribs. It's going to be there for support and cushion. Elastic cartilage. So now, again, you're seeing these big spaces. They're not as glassy looking as they were in this picture. It really kind of depends on the picture of elastic cartilage that you look at. But you're seeing these big spaces. These are way too big to be cells. So these are lacunae. The cells, the chondrocytes, are inside the lacunae. And now in the background, you're seeing these dark, stringy looking things. Those are elastic fibers. Elastic fibers always stain dark and they're always kind of stringy looking. So this tells you the fact that you see elastic fibers and you see these big, large lacunae, it's elastic cartilage. And then the last type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. This is a little more organized looking. You're seeing fibers that are more organized, running in parallel. Those are collagen fibers. Notice how small the nuclei and the lacunae that the nuclei are in are. They still have a little glassy appearance, so that tells you it's a lacuna and there's a chondrocyte nuclei inside there. So it tells you it's a cartilage, but much smaller cells, much smaller lacunae, and lots of organized layers of collagen fibers. So that tells you fibrocartilage. All right, so we went through connective tissue proper, the loose and dense connective tissues, and then we went through the cartilages. Now let's look at bone. There's actually two types of bone, but we're going to focus mostly on what we call osseous tissue or compact bone tissue. This is something, again, like the adipose tissue. When you look at bone tissue, you should know automatically what it is. You don't even have to think about it. And look, it looks like you're looking at the cross-section of tree trunks. Automatically, you know bone tissue. We're going to learn what all these different components are when we get to the bone histology chapter and lab. And then blood, another type of connective tissue. Again, this is another one. You should look at it and just know what it is. So you see, now this is something where you can use color to determine the tissue because blood tissue is always prepared the same way. So you're seeing these small pink cells with no nuclei. Those are red blood cells. They do not have a nucleus. If you were looking at adipose tissue, one, they would not stain pink, and two, you would see nuclei pushed up against the edge of those cells. You don't see that here. You see red blood cells, and then you'll see a few darker purpley staining cells. Those are white blood cells. So again, this is a very obvious type of tissue. All right, so those are the connective tissues. And again, you do need to practice just looking at these tissues. And the key here is you are seeing more than just cells. You'll see a background, and in many cases, you're going to see fibers. That's a clue that it's connective tissue. And now your job is to go through all these slides over and over and over again until you can get a feel for which one is which.